Banished to the unforgiving, frozen spine of the Wyoming mountains, she was meant to disappear. That was the Caldwell family's cruel decree for a young, defiant widow who refused to surrender her rightful inheritance. They sent her like unwanted cargo to a savage mountain man, a brute named Gideon, fully expecting the brutal wilderness to break her spirit or claim her life. What Arthur Caldwell didn't realize was that he hadn't handed Beatrice a death sentence. He had delivered her to the one man capable of unleashing her true strength. This is a story of bitter betrayal, frontier survival, and a revenge sweeter than a Rocky Mountain spring. The wind howling through the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range sounded like a choir of the damned. For Beatrice Caldwell, huddled in the back of a rattling, open-bed freight wagon, the sound was a fitting lullaby. Her heavy wool morning dress, completely inadequate for the biting November frost, offered little protection against the creeping chill. She was 24 years old, entirely alone, and cast out by the very people who were supposed to be her family. Just 3 weeks prior, Beatrice had been a respected wife in the bustling, prosperous town of Cheyenne. Her husband, Thomas Caldwell, had been a good man, a visionary who had built a lucrative cattle and timber empire. But Thomas had died suddenly of a mysterious fever that swept through his lungs with unnatural speed. Before the earth had even settled on his grave, Thomas's older brother, Arthur, had swooped in like a vulture. Arthur was a man of insatiable greed and ruthless cunning, and he possessed a forged will that left the entirety of the Caldwell estate to him, leaving Beatrice with nothing. When Beatrice declared her intention to challenge the document in a territorial court, citing Thomas's own letters as proof of the forgery, Arthur had taken drastic measures. He hadn't killed her that would have drawn the suspicion of the local marshals. Instead, he had orchestrated a fate he deemed far worse for a refined city woman. He had paid a heavy sum to a remote, reclusive trapper deep in the mountains, selling Beatrice off under the guise of an arranged frontier marriage to settle a fabricated family debt. "End of the line, widow," grunted Josiah, the foul-smelling teamster Arthur had hired for the transport. He hauled back on the reins, bringing the exhausted draft horses to a halt in snow that reached their knees. Beatrice blinked through ice-caked eyelashes. There was no town. There was no station. There was only a wall of towering lodgepole pines and a faint, treacherous trail winding upward into the blinding white oblivion. "Where is the settlement?" she asked, her voice cracking from the cold. Josiah let out a harsh bark of laughter, tossing her single leather trunk over the side of the wagon. It landed with a dull thud, sinking into a snowbank. "No settlement up here, lady. Just Hayes's Ridge. You follow that trail for about 2 miles. If you don't freeze first, you'll find his cabin. My contract with your brother-in-law ends here." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. "You cannot leave me here. It is miles to any civilization. There is a storm coming." "That ain't my problem," Josiah sneered, already turning the horses around with a crack of his whip. "Arthur said you were a gift for the mountain man. Whether you make it to his door or feed the wolves, I get paid the same." "Good luck, Mrs. Caldwell." Beatrice stood paralyzed in the knee-deep snow as the wagon disappeared down the mountain, the jingling of the harnesses fading until there was nothing but the deafening roar of the wind. The temperature was dropping rapidly. The sky above was the color of bruised iron, heavy with an impending blizzard. She looked at her trunk. It contained her mother's silver comb, a heavy quilt, Thomas's letters, and 3 dresses. It was too heavy to carry. With trembling hands, she popped the brass latches, dragged out the thickest quilt, and wrapped it securely around her shoulders over her thin coat. She shoved the letters inside her bodice, close to her heart. The rest, she abandoned. Survival was no longer a matter of wealth or status. It was simply a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. Beatrice began to walk. The snow dragged at her skirts like heavy, wet concrete. Every breath felt as though she were inhaling glass shards. The trail Josiah had pointed out was barely a depression in the snow, winding precariously up a steep incline. Hours seemed to bleed into one another. The world became a dizzying swirl of white. Her hands, encased in thin leather gloves, lost all feeling. Her legs shook violently, and her vision began to narrow, the edges going dark. "Arthur wants me to die," she thought, the sheer injustice of it fueling a tiny flickering ember of rage in her chest. He wants me to vanish so he can sit by his roaring fire, drinking Thomas's whiskey, spending Thomas's money. I will not let him win," she whispered to the wind, though the sound was snatched away instantly. But sheer willpower could only combat the elements for so long. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the forest into a shadowy, freezing twilight, Beatrice stumbled over a hidden root. She fell hard, her face sinking into the freezing powder. She tried to push herself up, to force her numb limbs to obey, but her strength was utterly spent. The cold began to feel less like pain and more like a heavy, seductive blanket. It would be so easy just to close her eyes for a moment, just to rest. As the darkness threatened to pull her under, a massive, dark shape detached itself from the tree line. Gideon Hayes did not like people. He liked the quiet of the high country, the predictable behavior of elk, and the honest, brutal reality of the seasons. Standing at 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and a thick beard that obscured the lower half of his rugged, weather-beaten face, he looked every bit the savage the valley folk claimed he was. He had been tracking a cougar that had been prowling too close to his mules when the storm front hit early. He was making his way back to his cabin, his heavy Sharps rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm, when his keen eyes caught an anomaly in the landscape. A splash of dark blue wool against the pristine white of a snowdrift. Gideon paused, narrowing his eyes against the biting wind. He approached with the silent, rolling gait of a man who had spent the last decade walking in the woods. When he reached the shape, he frowned. It was a woman. She was half buried in the snow, a thick quilt tangled around her. Gideon knelt, his large, calloused hand brushing the snow from her face. Her skin was as pale as marble, her lips tinged with a dangerous shade of blue. She was barely breathing. "What in God's name is a city woman doing up here?" he muttered, his deep voice barely a rumble in his chest. He didn't waste time looking for a wagon or a horse. Whoever had brought her had abandoned her. Slinging his rifle over his back, Gideon scooped her up. Even in her heavy, sodden skirts, she felt frighteningly light, like a hollow-boned bird. He held her tight against his thick sheepskin coat, using his own body heat to shield her from the wind, and broke into a steady, ground-eating run toward the safety of his cabin. Gideon's home was a sturdy, hand-hewn log structure, nestled into the side of the mountain, heavily insulated against the brutal winters. He kicked the heavy oak door open and carried her inside, instantly enveloped by the residual heat of the cast-iron stove. He laid her gently on his large bearskin rug near the hearth. He immediately set to work, adding logs to the dying embers until a roaring fire leaped to life, casting dancing orange shadows across the room. He knew the dangers of frostbite. With impersonal, clinical efficiency, he stripped away her frozen gloves, her sodden leather boots, and the heavy, ice-caked outer layer of her coat, and the wet quilt. He left her in her high-collared dress, wrapping her tightly in 3 thick woolen Hudson Bay blankets. He brewed a strong tea of pine needles and willow bark, sitting cross-legged beside her, watching her chest rise and fall with agonizing slowness. For a long time, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackling of the fire and the howling of the blizzard battering the log walls outside. It was near midnight when Beatrice finally stirred. A soft, pained moan escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of a turbulent winter sea. She stared at the rough-hewn logs of the ceiling, confusion clouding her gaze, before her memory rushed back. She gasped, jerking upright, pulling the blankets tightly to her chin. Her eyes locked onto Gideon, who was sitting quietly in a chair opposite the hearth, whittling a piece of cedar. To Beatrice, he looked like a giant, a wild creature formed from the mountain itself. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice raspy but surprisingly steady. Gideon stopped his knife. He studied her. Despite the dark circles under her eyes and her disheveled state, there was a fierce, unbroken spark in her stare. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't hysterical. "Name's Gideon," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You're in my cabin. Found you trying to sleep in a snowbank a mile down the trail. You're lucky I was hunting late, or you'd be a block of ice right now." Beatrice took a slow, shuddering breath, looking around the small, immaculately kept cabin. traps hung on the walls alongside dried herbs and pelts. It was rustic, but not chaotic. "You are the mountain man, the one Arthur paid." Gideon's brow furrowed. He set his knife and wood down on a side table. "Arthur? Who is Arthur? And what are you talking about, paying me?" Beatrice paused, her mind working frantically. "Arthur Caldwell. My brother-in-law. He told me I was being sent here as a punishment, that he paid you to take me as a wife to settle a debt, so I would be out of his way in Cheyenne." Gideon stood up, his massive frame dominating the small room. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Lady, I don't know any Arthur Caldwell, and I sure as hell don't take payment in human beings. I haven't been down to Cheyenne in 5 years. Nobody sent me anything." Beatrice stared at him, the horrifying truth dawning on her. Arthur hadn't paid this man to take her in. Arthur had simply paid the teamster to drop her in the most remote, hostile territory he could think of, using the local legend of a savage mountain man as a ghost story to terrify her on the journey. He had never expected her to make it to any cabin. He had sent her up here to die in the snow, completely untraceable. "He wanted me dead," she whispered, the words hanging heavy in the warm air. "He used your ridge as a graveyard." Gideon watched the realization wash over her. He had seen many things break people in the wild: fear, cold, starvation. He expected her to crumble. Instead, Beatrice Caldwell lifted her chin. Her shivering stopped, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. "I have been stripped of my home, my husband, and my fortune," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "My brother-in-law thinks I am currently buried under 3 feet of snow. Mr. Hayes, I apologize for intruding upon your solitude, but I require your assistance." Gideon crossed his arms, intrigued despite his better judgment. "Assistance doing what?" Beatrice looked directly into his eyes, the firelight reflecting in her own. "I am going to survive the winter here, and when the snow thaws, I am going to return to Cheyenne, and I am going to destroy Arthur Caldwell. Will you help me? Or shall I walk back out into the snow?" Gideon let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sounded like rocks shifting underground. The mountain had sent him many things over the years, but it had never sent him a woman with eyes full of murder. "You're not walking anywhere in that weather, widow," Gideon said, turning toward the stove to pour a cup of the hot tea. "Drink this. You're going to need your strength. It seems we have a lot to talk about." The Wyoming winter was not merely a season. It was a brutal, living entity that sought to crush anything foolish enough to stand against it. For the first 2 weeks, Beatrice was a prisoner of the cabin, her body fighting off the deep-seated chill that had nearly stopped her heart. Gideon Hayes proved to be a stoic, capable nurse. He fed her rich venison broth, applied foul-smelling but effective poultices of spruce pitch to her frost-nipped toes, and never once asked for her gratitude. As Beatrice's strength returned, the stark reality of her situation set in. The cabin, though well-built, was small. The silence between them was often deafening, filled only by the crackle of the hearth and the constant, battering howl of the wind outside. Back in Cheyenne, Beatrice had managed a household of servants, hosted lavish dinners at the exclusive Cheyenne Club, and navigated the high-stakes politics of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, alongside her late husband, Thomas. Here, her wealth meant nothing. Her aristocratic pedigree was useless against a blizzard. She refused to be a burden. On the 15th day, she stood up, her legs trembling slightly, and took the heavy iron poker from Gideon's hand as he went to stoke the fire. "I am not a porcelain doll, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice firm, though her knuckles were white. "If I am to survive the winter here, I must learn how to live in it. Put me to work." Gideon, who had been watching her with quiet skepticism for a fortnight, slowly leaned back on his heels. He studied the fierce set of her jaw, the way her turbulent gray eyes met his without flinching. A slow, respectful nod was his only answer. The forging of Beatrice Caldwell began the next morning. Gideon replaced her ruined city boots with a pair of thick, fur-lined moccasins he had traded from the Shoshone, and cut down an old wool coat to fit her slender frame. He taught her the brutal arithmetic of mountain survival. She learned to split green cedar without snapping the axe handle, her palms bleeding until they developed thick, leathery calluses. She learned to skin a hare, her stomach churning the first few times she plunged her hands into the warm viscera, until the task became as mechanical as embroidering a handkerchief. The most crucial lesson, however, was the steel. Gideon placed his heavy Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle into her hands. It was a heavy, unforgiving piece of machinery. "Arthur Caldwell didn't just steal a fortune. He stole your protection," Gideon told her one afternoon, their breath pluming in the freezing air as they stood in a clearing behind the cabin. "Out here, and back down in the valleys, the only law that matters is the one you can enforce yourself. Plant your feet. Don't flinch when it kicks." She bruised her shoulder black and blue. She missed the target, a scarred pine stump 50 yards away 100 times. But Beatrice was fueled by a cold, burning hatred for the man who had left her to die, and a growing, unspoken admiration for the giant of a man teaching her to fight back. By January, she could put a Dauphin of Beatrice, 44-40 bullet through a hanging tin cup at 70 paces in a dead wind. As the months bled into one another, the frosty distance between Beatrice and Gideon began to thaw. The long, dark evenings were spent beside the fire. Stripped of the superficial constraints of society, they began to talk. Gideon, it turned out, was not just a wild beast of the ridge. He had been a scout for the U.S. Cavalry, and later, a surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad. "I staked out the very land your husband's empire sits on," Gideon revealed one night, his deep voice filling the quiet room as he oiled his traps. "But a group of land speculators out of Laramie men, much like your brother-in-law, decided they didn't want to pay the agreed price for my surveys. They bribed a territorial judge, a man named Horace Plunkett, to sign a warrant for my arrest on trumped-up charges of rustling. It was either swing from a cottonwood on false pretenses or disappear into the Wind River Range." Beatrice looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He wasn't a savage hiding from civilization. He was a good man exiled by the very corruption that had destroyed her life. The realization shifted something fundamental within her. When Gideon looked back at her, his dark eyes held a raw, unguarded intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The mountain man had spent years hardening his heart to the world, but this fierce, unbreakable widow was systematically dismantling his defenses. "They took everything from you, too," Beatrice whispered softly, reaching out to touch his rough, scarred hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Gideon didn't pull away. "They took what I had," Gideon murmured, his thumb gently brushing her calloused knuckles. "But I reckon the mountain gave me something better in return." April arrived not with the gentle bloom of spring flowers, but with the violent, muddy chaos of the mountain thaw. The snowpack began to rot from the bottom up, turning the slopes into treacherous, slushy slides. The ice on the high creeks fractured with sounds like cannon fire. For Beatrice and Gideon, the changing of the season meant one thing: the passes would soon be clear enough to make the descent to Cheyenne. Beatrice had changed entirely. The delicate, pale widow was gone. In her place was a lean, hardened woman of the frontier, her skin bronzed by the high-altitude sun, her eyes sharp and constantly scanning her surroundings. They were packing the mules on a crisp, bright morning when Gideon's massive wolf hybrid dog, a beast named Brutus, suddenly snapped to attention. The hackles on the dog's back rose, and a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. Gideon dropped the saddlebags instantly, his hand moving in a blur to draw the Colt revolver at his hip. "Get inside," he ordered Beatrice, his voice a sharp whip crack. "Now." Beatrice didn't argue. She darted into the cabin, snatching her Winchester from the wall mount and taking a position by the heavy shuttered window. She peered through the firing slit. Emerging from the tree line were 3 men. They were not lost travelers. They wore heavy canvas dusters and rode premium thoroughbreds that looked exhausted from the climb. They were heavily armed. Beatrice recognized the man in the lead instantly, and a jolt of pure ice shot through her veins. It was Amos Reed. He was a notorious enforcer in Cheyenne, a ruthless gun-for-hire frequently employed by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association to intimidate small homesteaders. And he was Arthur Caldwell's personal shadow. Arthur didn't leave it to chance. Beatrice hissed to herself, her finger slipping inside the trigger guard of the Winchester. He sent them to confirm the kill. Gideon stepped out from the porch, his rifle casually resting against his shoulder, though every muscle in his massive frame was coiled tight. "You boys are a long way from the saloons," Gideon called out, his voice echoing in the clearing. "Private Ridge, turn those horses around." Amos Reed spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the melting snow. He looked at the giant mountain man with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "We ain't looking for trouble, mountain man. We're looking for a body. Or some bones. Woman got lost up here back in November. Wealthy widow. Name of Caldwell. We represent the family. We're here to collect any personal effects. Prove she's dead so the estate can be finalized. Ain't seen no woman." Gideon lied smoothly, his eyes tracking the two men flanking Reed, who were subtly shifting their hands toward their holsters. "That's a shame," Reed said, a cruel smile spreading across his face, "because Josiah the Teamster swore he dropped her at the bottom of your trail. And word in the valley is, you don't miss much. So, we're gonna come in and have a little look around your cabin, just to be thorough. You take one more step toward my door," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm, "and I'll drop you where you stand." The shootout erupted with explosive violence. One of Reed's men drew his weapon, but Gideon was faster. The mountain man's rifle cracked, and the hired gun was thrown backward off his horse, dead before he hit the mud. Reed and the remaining thugs spurred their horses, diving for the cover of the woodpile while unleashing a hail of lead toward the cabin. Bullets splintered the porch railing and thudded heavily into the oak door. Gideon dove behind a large water trough, returning fire, pinning the men down. Inside the cabin, Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were perfectly steady. She tracked the remaining thug, who was trying to flank Gideon by crawling through the slush behind the woodpile. He raised his revolver, aiming directly at Gideon's exposed back. Beatrice exhaled, settling the iron sights squarely on the center of the man's chest. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, filling the cabin with acrid white smoke. The thug outside jolted violently, dropping his gun, and collapsed face first into the snowmelt. Amos Reed, realizing he was suddenly outgunned and outmaneuvered, scrambled in panic. He threw himself onto his horse, hauling roughly on the reins. "Arthur will hear about this." "You savage!" Reed screamed, spurring the horse back down the treacherous trail, leaving his dead companions behind. The clearing fell deathly silent, save for the frantic panting of the horses and the drip of melting ice. Gideon slowly stood up from behind the trough. He looked at the dead man near the woodpile, then turned his gaze toward the cabin window. Beatrice stepped out onto the porch, the smoking rifle still in her hands. She looked at the blood staining the pristine white snow, but she felt no remorse. She only felt a profound, terrifying clarity. Gideon walked up the steps, his dark eyes searching her face. "You saved my life, Beatrice. You saved mine first," she replied, her voice steady. She looked down the trail where Amos Reed had fled. "Arthur knows I am not dead now. He knows we are here." Gideon reached out, his large hand cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed away a smudge of gunpowder from her cheek. "Then we don't wait for him to send an army. We pack the rest of the supplies. Tomorrow at first light, we ride for Cheyenne." Beatrice leaned into his touch, the fire of revenge burning brighter than ever in her chest. "Tomorrow, we take back what is mine." Descending from the unforgiving altitudes of the Wind River Range took 4 grueling days. The transition from pristine, deadly wilderness to the sprawling, muddy civilization of the plains jarring to them both. Cheyenne, often dubbed the magic city of the plains for its rapid explosion of wealth, was a chaotic symphony of booming locomotives, bawling cattle, and the clinking of whiskey glasses. To Beatrice Caldwell, it was no longer home. It was a battlefield. They did not ride down Capitol Avenue, where the opulent mansions of the cattle barons stood like monuments to greed. Instead, Gideon guided their exhausted horses through the labyrinthine alleys of the rail yards, securing a discreet, windowless room in a boarding house frequented by Union Pacific line workers. Beatrice stood before a cracked, silver-backed mirror in the dim room, staring at the stranger looking back at her. The pallid, grieving widow in high-collared silk was dead, buried under 3 feet of November snow. The woman in the glass possessed skin kissed by the harsh mountain sun, a smattering of pale scars across her knuckles from splitting cedar, and eyes that held the cold, calculating depth of a winter storm. She unpinned her tangled hair, letting it fall in a cascade over her shoulders, and turned to Gideon. The giant mountain man was meticulously cleaning his Colt revolver by the light of a single kerosene lamp. He looked massive and out of place within the confined plaster walls, like a caged grizzly. "Arthur will be well guarded," Gideon rumbled, not looking up from the oiled cylinder of his weapon. "Amos Reed is a coward, but he's a survivor. He rode straight back here and told your brother-in-law what happened on the ridge. They will be watching the train depot, the stagecoach lines, and the roads. They are looking for a traumatized widow and a wild mountain man," Beatrice replied, her voice smooth and devoid of fear. "We will give them neither. Before we strike, we need to know exactly how Arthur has fortified my husband's empire. I need to see Thaddeus Sterling." Thaddeus Sterling was the senior partner at the First National Bank of Cheyenne. More importantly, he was the only man in the territory who had loved Thomas Caldwell like a son, and the only man Beatrice believed Arthur's dirty money could not buy. Getting to Sterling required stealth. That evening, under the cover of a freezing spring drizzle, Beatrice draped herself in a heavy, nondescript woolen shawl, hiding her face. Gideon shadowed her from across the muddy streets, a silent, looming protector melting in and out of the gaslight shadows. They reached Sterling's private residence on the outskirts of the wealthy district. When the elderly banker opened his heavy oak door and peered into the darkness, his face drained of all color. He staggered backward as Beatrice lowered her hood. "My God," Thaddeus choked out, clutching his chest. "Beatrice, the papers. Arthur swore you were lost to the fever down in Denver. We held a memorial. Arthur is a liar, a thief, and a murderer." "Thaddeus," Beatrice said, stepping into the warm foyer and pulling Gideon in behind her. "He sent me to the mountains to freeze. If not for Mr. Hayes here, I would be bones in the snow." Thaddeus led them into his private study, pouring 3 fingers of straight bourbon with trembling hands. As Beatrice recounted the harrowing winter on the ridge and the shootout with Amos Reed, the old banker's grief morphed into a hardened, bitter fury. "That absolute bastard," Thaddeus hissed, slamming his glass onto the mahogany desk. "It makes perfect, sickening sense now. Beatrice, Arthur hasn't just stolen the Caldwell Cattle Company. He is liquidating it." Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Liquidating?" "Thomas spent a decade building those herds and timber mills. Arthur doesn't want to run an empire. He wants cash to disappear to Europe," Thaddeus explained, pulling a leather-bound ledger from his safe. "Tomorrow night at the Cheyenne Club, Arthur is hosting a private gala. He is signing over the entirety of the Caldwell land rights, the cattle, and the railroads to the Scottish-American Mortgage Company. Their chief investor, an absolute shark named Archibald Campbell, is in town to finalize the purchase. Arthur has produced a newly discovered addendum to Thomas's will, supposedly granting him the sole power of attorney to sell the estate. The territorial judge, Horace Plunkett, authenticated it yesterday." Gideon, who had been leaning silently against the bookshelves, suddenly straightened. "Judge Horace Plunkett?" "Yes." Thaddeus looked at the large man, intimidated by his presence. "He handles all the estate law in the territory." A slow, terrifying smile crept across Gideon's bearded face. "Plunkett is the same corrupt judge who signed the fraudulent arrest warrants for the Union Pacific surveyors 5 years ago. He is bought and paid for by land speculators. Arthur didn't just find a judge, he bought Plunkett's premium services." "If Arthur signs those papers tomorrow night," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "the Caldwell estate will belong to the Scottish syndicate. The money will be wired to offshore accounts, and Arthur will vanish. I will have no legal recourse to reclaim what is mine." "Then we don't let him sign," Gideon stated simply. "It is a fortress, Beatrice," Thaddeus warned, his voice shaking. "The Cheyenne Club is heavily guarded by private Pinkerton detectives, and Arthur has Amos Reed's thugs patrolling the perimeter. You cannot simply walk in. If Arthur sees you, he will have you shot on sight and claim you were a deranged imposter." "I don't intend to walk in alone," Beatrice said, reaching into the bodice of her dress and pulling out a small oilskin-wrapped package. She unwrapped it to reveal the letters she had salvaged from her trunk months ago. "These are Thomas's personal letters to me, written the week before he died. In them, He details his exact suspicions that Arthur was embezzling from the company, and he explicitly states he was drafting a new will to cut Arthur out completely. Thaddeus adjusted his spectacles, reading the crisp handwriting. This is explosive. With this, a federal court could freeze the sale instantly. A territorial court won't do it, not with Plunkett in Arthur's pocket, Gideon noted. We need federal authority, someone who hates local corruption. Federal Inspector Nathaniel Blackwood, Thaddeus said instantly. He is operating out of Laramie right now, auditing the railroad land grants. He despises Plunkett. If I wire him tonight, he could be on the evening train tomorrow. Beatrice stood up, the fire of the mountain ridge burning in her eyes. Wire him, Thaddeus. Tell him to meet us at the Cheyenne Club at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Arthur Caldwell has operated in the shadows for long enough. Tomorrow, we drag him into the light. Gaslight spilled like liquid gold from the towering arched windows of the Cheyenne Club, illuminating the sleek carriages and exhausted horses lining the muddy street. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of imported Havana cigars, expensive French perfume, and the intoxicating arrogance of untethered wealth. The ballroom was a sea of silk gowns and tailored worsted wool suits. At the center of the room, standing beneath a massive crystal chandelier, was Arthur Caldwell. He was a handsome man, but it was a cruel, sharp sort of handsome. He held a glass of champagne, laughing uproariously at a joke made by Archibald Campbell, the doer, fiercely wealthy Scottish investor. To the expansion of the West, Mr. Campbell, Arthur declared, raising his glass, and to mutually beneficial partnerships. Aye, Campbell grunted, his eyes scanning the room. Assuming the paperwork is ironclad, Mr. Caldwell. My syndicate does not tolerate legal entanglements. I assure you, my brother's estate is entirely in my legal possession. Arthur smiled smoothly, though a bead of sweat prickled at his hairline. He glanced nervously toward the heavy mahogany double doors, where Amos Reed stood flanking the entrance with two heavily armed thugs. Reed had been on edge since his disastrous return from the mountains, swearing the mountain man was a demon. Arthur had doubled his security, but he was desperate to get this signature and flee the territory. Outside in the freezing rain, a black carriage rolled to a silent halt at the rear kitchen entrance of the club. Beatrice stepped down into the mud. She was not wearing her mountain wool, nor was she wearing morning clothes. Thanks to Thaddeus Sterling's swift arrangements, she wore a breathtaking gown of deep, blood-red velvet. It was a warrior's color. Her hair was swept up, pinned with her mother's silver comb, but no powder could hide the fierce, sun-kissed angles of her face or the hardened set of her jaw. Tucked discreetly into a custom holster strapped to her thigh beneath the velvet was a loaded double-barreled Derringer. Beside her, Gideon had shed his heavy sheepskin coat for a dark, tailored suit that Thaddeus had procured. The fine clothes barely contained the raw, coiled muscle of his frame. He looked like a wolf forced into a dog collar, civilized on the surface, but profoundly dangerous underneath. Ready? Gideon asked softly, his hand resting on the brass handle of the kitchen door. I have been ready since November, Beatrice replied. They moved through the bustling kitchens with terrifying purpose. Gideon dispatched two of Arthur's hired guards in the pantry with brutal, silent efficiency, dropping them to the floor before they could even draw a breath to shout. They bypassed the main lobby, moving up the servants' staircase toward the grand ballroom. In the ballroom, Judge Horace Plunkett had just unrolled the massive parchment deed onto a mahogany table. If you will just sign here, Mr. Campbell. And here, Mr. Caldwell. The transfer of the Caldwell Cattle Company will be complete. Arthur picked up the gold-nibbed pen, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He dipped it into the inkwell. I wouldn't sign that, Mr. Campbell, unless you wish to be indicted for purchasing stolen property. The voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a straight razor. It was neither loud nor hysterical, but it possessed a commanding, icy authority that brought the entire ballroom to a dead halt. Arthur's hand froze, hovering inches above the parchment. He turned slowly, the color draining from his face until he was as pale as a corpse. Standing at the top of the grand staircase, framed by the velvet curtains, was Beatrice Caldwell. The red gown made her look like an avenging angel. Beside her stood the towering, terrifying figure of Gideon Hayes, his dark eyes locked onto Amos Reed across the room. Beatrice, Arthur whispered, the pen slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the floor. Panic rippled through the high society crowd. Gasps erupted as people recognized the widow they had buried in absentia months ago. Amos Reed's hand immediately dropped to his holster. "It's an imposter," Reed bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. "Shoot them!" Before Reed's revolver could clear leather, Gideon moved. He vaulted over the banister, landing with a heavy thud on the ballroom floor. In a blur of motion, he drew his Colt, not to shoot, but to bring the heavy steel barrel crashing down across Amos Reed's jaw. The crack of bone echoed like a gunshot. Reed collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Gideon turned his weapon on the remaining thugs, his eyes promising instant death. They slowly raised their hands, stepping away from their guns. Beatrice descended the stairs, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. She walked straight toward Arthur, who was backing away from the table, his chest heaving. "You're dead," Arthur stammered, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You died of the fever in Denver." "No, Arthur," Beatrice said, stopping 3 feet from him. "You sent me to the Wind River Ridge. You paid Josiah the Teamster to abandon me in a blizzard. You intended for the mountain to kill me, but the mountain forged me instead." Archibald Campbell stepped forward, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" "Arthur, who is this woman?" "I am Beatrice Caldwell," she announced to the room, but her eyes never left Arthur, the rightful heir and sole executor of Thomas Caldwell's estate. "This man forged a will to steal my husband's legacy." Judge Plunkett puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his authority. "Now see here, madam. I authenticated that will myself. You are making baseless, hysterical accusations against a respected gentleman." "Are they baseless, Judge Plunkett?" The heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. Striding into the room, flanked by 4 heavily armed U.S. Marshals, was Federal Inspector Nathaniel Blackwood. He was a tall, severe man with a reputation for mercilessly hunting down corruption. Behind him walked Thaddeus Sterling, clutching a leather briefcase. Inspector Blackwood marched directly to the table, ignoring Arthur entirely, and glared down at the sweating territorial judge. "We have a wire from Denver, Plunkett. The telegraph records show Arthur Caldwell transferred $5,000 into your brother's bank account the day before you miraculously discovered this addendum to the Caldwell will." Arthur lunged for the table, desperate to tear the deed, but Gideon was there in a flash. He grabbed Arthur by the collar of his expensive suit, hoisting the man off his feet and slamming him hard against the oak-paneled wall. Arthur whimpered, dangling helplessly in the mountain man's iron grip. Beatrice took the oilskin package from Thaddeus Sterling and handed the letters to Archibald Campbell. "Read them, Mr. Campbell. My husband's final letters. He knew Arthur was stealing. He was cutting him out. The document on that table is a complete fabrication." Campbell read the letters swiftly, his face hardening into a mask of pure Scottish fury. He turned to Arthur, spitting on the floor near his feet. "You tried to sell me a fraud. If the law doesn't hang you, Caldwell, my syndicate will." Inspector Blackwood nodded to his marshals. "Arrest Arthur Caldwell for fraud, embezzlement, and attempted murder. And put Judge Plunkett in irons as well. We will see how much he likes the federal penitentiary." As the marshals dragged a sobbing, broken Arthur away, the ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Beatrice stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage of her brother-in-law's scheme. She had won. She had her home back. She had her fortune back. But as she looked up at Gideon, the man who had pulled her from the snow, who had taught her to shoot, who had crossed the state to help her exact her vengeance, she realized that the fortune no longer mattered. Gideon holstered his gun, looking around the opulent, suffocating ballroom with deep distaste. He met her gaze, the unspoken question hanging heavily in the air between them. The deed was done. The mountain man's work in the city was finished. What happened next was entirely up to the widow. Reclaiming the Caldwell estate was a hollow victory. For 3 weeks following Arthur's dramatic arrest, Beatrice resided in the sprawling 20-room Victorian mansion that Thomas had built for her. Federal Inspector Nathaniel Blackwood had moved with ruthless efficiency, seizing Arthur's assets, freezing the offshore accounts, and returning the Caldwell Cattle Company to its rightful owner. The society matrons of Cheyenne, The very women who had gossips about her mysterious fever and attended her fraudulent memorial now flocked to her parlor, leaving calling cards and dripping with false sympathy. Beatrice received them with cold, practiced politeness, but their perfume suffocated her. The imported Persian rugs felt too soft beneath her boots. The lavish, multi-course dinners tasted like ash. Every night, she lay awake in her massive canopy bed, listening to the clatter of carriages on the cobblestones, desperately missing the absolute terrifying silence of the high ridge and the smell of wood smoke. She missed Gideon. The mountain man had refused her offer to stay in the mansion. The opulence made his skin crawl. Instead, he had remained at the modest boarding house near the rail yards, waiting only to testify at Judge Horace Plunkett's preliminary federal hearing. With the legal proceedings now firmly in Thaddeus Sterling's capable hands, Gideon's tether to the city had frayed to nothing. On a muggy Tuesday evening, Beatrice sat in Thomas's mahogany-paneled study. She was the wealthiest woman in the Wyoming Territory, yet she had never felt more impoverished. A sharp rap at the heavy front doors broke her reverie. Her loyal butler, an elderly man named Higgins who had wept upon her return, opened the door. Beatrice heard a low, familiar rumble in the foyer. She dropped her pen and hurried out of the study. Gideon stood in the entryway. He was back in his worn sheepskin coat and high leather boots, his saddlebag slung over one massive shoulder. His wolf hybrid, Brutus, sat obediently at his heel, panting in the humid city air. Gideon looked up at the crystal chandelier, then down at the polished marble floor, looking like a magnificent, trapped beast. "Mr. Hayes," Beatrice said, her heart giving a painful lurch. "Widow Caldwell." Gideon nodded respectfully, though his dark eyes held a profound sadness. "The federal marshals said they have all the statements they need. The judge and your brother-in-law are being transferred to the penitentiary in Leavenworth tomorrow. My business here is done." Beatrice gripped the carved wooden banister. "You are leaving for the mountains. The snowmelt is finishing," Gideon said, shifting his weight. "The elk will be moving to the high pastures. I've been away from the ridge too long. I came to say my goodbyes." A heavy, suffocating silence fell between them. The polite, civilized world dictated that she thank him, offer him a substantial financial reward for his services, and wish him well. But the woman forged on the frozen ridge refused to abide by the rules of a society that had left her for dead. Before Beatrice could speak, a massive, shattering crash echoed from the rear of the house. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood tore through the quiet evening. Brutus erupted into vicious barks, the hair on his back standing straight up. Gideon dropped his saddlebags instantly, his hand flying to the Colt revolver at his hip. "Get behind me," he ordered, the civilized veneer vanishing in a second, replaced by the deadly instinct of the frontier scout. From the shadows of the long hallway leading to the kitchen, a figure emerged. It was Amos Reed, but he was a horrifying shadow of the arrogant enforcer he had once been. His jaw, shattered by Gideon's pistol whip at the Cheyenne Club, was wired shut with crude steel braces. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. Arthur's empire had collapsed, leaving Reed penniless, humiliated, and wanted by the Pinkertons. He had nothing left to lose, and he had come for the woman who had destroyed his life. Reed raised a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun, pointing it directly at Beatrice. "Amos, drop it!" Gideon roared, raising his Colt. Reed didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. Gideon lunged, shoving Beatrice hard to the marble floor just as the shotgun discharged. The deafening blast shredded the heavy oak banister where Beatrice had been standing a second before, raining splinters and plaster down upon them. Before Reed could fire the second barrel, Brutus charged. The massive wolf dog leaped through the smoke, sinking his teeth into Reed's forearm. Reed screamed through his wired jaw, swinging the heavy stock of the shotgun down on the dog's skull. Brutus yelped and fell back, stunned. Reed turned the weapon back toward Gideon, but the mountain man was already moving. Gideon tackled Reed with the force of a runaway locomotive, driving the enforcer through the double doors of the formal dining room. They crashed onto the long, polished mahogany table, shattering crystal glasses and porcelain plates in a chaotic symphony of destruction. Beatrice scrambled to her feet. She didn't scream or panic. She hitched up her heavy velvet skirts and sprinted for the study. She threw open the glass display cabinet where Thomas had kept his prized hunting rifles, grabbing her Winchester and a handful of shells. Her hands moved with the practiced mechanical precision Gideon had taught her on the ridge. In the dining room, the fight was a brutal, primitive struggle for survival. Reed was fueled by sheer psychotic adrenaline, pulling a long serrated hunting knife from his boot. He slashed wildly, catching Gideon's forearm. Blood soaked into the sheepskin sleeve, but Gideon didn't even flinch. He grabbed Reed's wrist with his massive, calloused hand, twisting it with a sickening snap of bone. Reed dropped the knife, howling in agony. Gideon seized the enforcer by the collar and belt, lifting the grown man over his head with terrifying strength. With a primal roar, he hurled Reed through the massive stained glass window that looked out onto the gardens. Reed crashed through the colorful glass depicting the Wyoming state seal, landing broken and unconscious in the rose bushes outside. The night air rushed into the ruined dining room, thick with the smell of cordite and rain. Gideon stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his arm bleeding freely onto the expensive Persian rug. He looked around at the destroyed finery of the Caldwell estate. Beatrice stepped into the doorway, the loaded Winchester steady against her shoulder. She lowered the weapon, taking in the blood, the shattered glass, and the magnificent, savage man standing in the center of it all. "The city is far too dangerous for me, Mr. Hayes," Beatrice said softly, resting the rifle against the doorframe. She walked toward him, ignoring the ruined silk of her dress, and took his bleeding arm. She pulled a clean linen napkin from the debris and began to tightly bind the wound. Gideon looked down at her, his breathing slowing. "He won't bother you again. The marshals will hear the shot. They'll be here in minutes." "Let them come," Beatrice said, tying the makeshift bandage with a firm knot. She looked up, her turbulent gray eyes locking onto his. "I have made a decision. Thaddeus Sterling is an honest man and a brilliant banker. First thing tomorrow, I am signing the executive power of the Caldwell Cattle Company over to him in a blind trust. He can run the empire. He can deal with the Scottish syndicates and the society dinners." Gideon frowned, confusion crossing his rugged features. "You fought tooth and nail for this wealth, Beatrice. You nearly died for it." "I fought for justice," she corrected him, her voice unwavering. "I fought so Arthur would not win. But this house, this money, it is a ghost town to me now. My fortune is not here." She reached up, her hand gently resting against his bearded cheek. "I told you once that the mountain gave you something better in return for what you lost. I believe it did the same for me." Gideon's dark eyes softened, the wild, guarded walls he had built around his heart finally, permanently crumbling. He covered her hand with his own. "Winter is over, Beatrice. The ridge is a hard life. It ain't meant for a queen of the plains. Good thing I am a widowed woman banished to the mountains." Then she smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up the ruined room. "Pack an extra horse, Gideon. We ride at dawn." The following morning, as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant shades of violet and gold, two riders slipped out of the city limits, a massive wolf dog trotting happily alongside them. Behind them lay a reclaimed empire, but ahead of them, towering above the plains, were the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Wind River Range. The Caldwell family had sent her there as a cruel punishment, hoping to break her. Instead, they had given her the greatest treasure of all, her freedom, her strength, and a love forged in the unforgiving ice. Beatrice and Gideon's story proves that the fires of adversity often forge the strongest steel. Stripped of her wealth and cast into the deadly wilderness, Beatrice didn't just survive. She evolved, transforming a brutal punishment into a triumphant return that shook the very foundations of the corrupt society that betrayed her. In the end, true wealth wasn't found in cattle or gold, but in the unbreakable bond forged on that frozen mountain ridge. If you found yourself holding your breath during Beatrice's incredible journey of frontier survival, revenge, and unexpected romance, please take a moment to like this video. Share this epic Western saga with friends who love a gritty, real-life drama, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another thrilling story of resilience and justice.